Mrs Elton was first seen at church, but though devotion might be interrupted, curiosity could not be satisfied by a bride in a pew, and it must be left for the visits in form. I'm Harriet.
And I'm Ellen, and this is Reading Jane Austen.
This week we're looking at chapters 32 to 36 of Emma. So let's start with your 100-word summary.
The Eltons arrive and are called on by all Highbury. Emma and her circle regard Mrs Elton as vulgar. Mrs Elton claims to have made Jane Fairfax her protégée. Emma and Mrs Weston suggest to Knightley that he is in love with Jane, but he denies it. John Knightley and his sons arrive on the day Emma has planned a dinner for the Eltons, and they encounter Jane Fairfax proposing to call at the post office in the rain. After dinner, Mrs Elton pesters Jane about finding a position as governess. Mr Weston announces that the Churchill family is coming to London.
Okay. I've covered some things that you didn't and left out some things that you included.
Well, that's what always happens.
Yep. So, Mrs Elton arrives in Highbury. Emma finds her very vulgar and doesn't like her at all. Mrs Elton takes up Jane Fairfax, and Emma doesn't understand why Jane puts up with it. Mrs Weston suggests Jane might like some variety from Miss Bates, and Mr Knightley points out that nobody else, by which he means Emma, is offering friendship to Jane. Emma suggests, and he denies, that he might be falling in love with Jane. Emma holds a dinner for Mrs Elton. The conversation includes the post office, governess situations, Frank Churchill coming to London, the Sucklings, and Maple Grove.
Right.
Did you have any general comments you wanted to make on the chapters?
There's this whole concern I have that Jane Austen is really interested in looking at this society of Highbury, and yet I feel she's made a bit of a muddle. We're told there are all these people who are calling on Mrs Elton. But who are they? The only ones we've ever heard of are the Coxes and the Perrys and the Coles and Mrs Goddard and the Bateses, of course. Yep. Does anyone else come in? I don't think Jane Austen ever tells us exactly how much of the county families are being involved.
I guess the question is, are there more families in Highbury that we're just not given the names of? Or do the calls come from wider afield?
It's a bit awkward. Jane Austen is implying this periphery, but it's very ghostly.
Well, I suppose there's only so many characters you want to introduce by name and get to know.
I suppose what I'm feeling is she is not as artistic or as creative in making this as perhaps she could be. After all, she does a better job at indicating that there is a periphery for the Bennets, that there is a periphery even for Mansfield Park. We hear such detail about some of the people in Highbury and nothing about this periphery.
So chapter 32 is really just about paying calls. Emma calls on Mrs Elton and Mrs Elton returns the call.
Yes.
And what really comes through in this chapter is that Emma doesn't like Mrs Elton.
Yes, but just before that, you get what I think is really sweet is Harriet's response to seeing her, where she says, I think her beautiful, quite beautiful. Just such a generous-minded response she's having.
I do love, after the second call, Emma's outrage at Mrs Elton. First of all, when Mrs Elton says she could take Mr Woodhouse to Bath, and Emma is appalled at the idea of her being indebted to Mrs Elton for what was called an introduction. But I suppose even more, the bit I love is when Mrs Elton is left and we have, insufferable woman was her immediate exclamation. Worse than I had supposed. Absolutely insufferable. Knightley. I could not have believed it. Knightley. Never seen him in her life before, and call him Knightley. And discover that he is a gentleman. A little upstart vulgar being with her Mr E and her caro sposo and her resources and all her airs of pert pretensions and underbred finery. Actually to discover that Mr Knightley is a gentleman. I doubt whether he will return the compliment and discover her to be a lady. It is so funny.
Yes, her absolute outrage.
She finds Mrs Elton appalling, and I think it's fair to say that Mr Knightley and Mrs Weston are all in agreement that she is
appalling.
But everyone else in Highbury is quite happy with her. It does say that the greater part of her new acquaintance, disposed to command or not in the habit of judging, following the lead of Miss Bates' goodwill, or taking it for granted that the bride must be as clever and as agreeable as she professed herself, were very well satisfied.
Yes.
So it's kind of, does seem a little odd that only these three people can see her for what she is.
Well, I mean, what's also been said, these are the ones who know what real elegance is.
True.
And its elegance tends to be the word that is used there to describe the difference between, she has no true elegance right at the beginning. Emma picks that.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's interesting, though, is what this reveals about the need the village feels to keep everything nice. Emma can't bear Mrs Elton, but she still has a dinner party for her. Mr Knightley pretty well can't bear Mrs Elton. He will always invite her to anything that's happening.
Yeah.
They're absolutely determined that they have a society that has to be kept in balance, however much they dislike the members of it.
Well, I suppose, though, that's what you do. That is a civil society. Sometimes, when you have a wedding or a big party, often you have to invite people that you actually don't really want to invite.
Yes, but I suppose not quite to the extent that they're doing.
Yeah.
I think, again, they have this belief in country hospitality, in inviting all the people you know and keeping them together.
I think whether or not we like Emma...
Look, Emma behaves extraordinarily well to Mrs Elton. I mean, Emma doesn't put her down. She doesn't make smart remarks to her.
Yeah.
She doesn't even make smart remarks to Miss Bates or Mrs Bates. She only mentions what she feels to Mr Knightley and Mrs Weston.
Yeah.
And, I really doubt if she's even says it properly to Mr Weston. And she doesn't even say it to Harriet.
Yeah.
She's really working very hard to preserve the surface of the society. She says nothing to Harriet to stop Harriet admiring Mrs Elton. She keeps it very much buttoned up.
So then chapter 33 is more about Mrs Elton. This is where Mrs Elton feels she's been rebuffed by Emma. So instead she starts patronising Jane.
Which I think probably she was ready to take up Jane anyway.
Yeah.
She's looking for a protege.
Yeah. In many ways, how different is it from Emma taking up Harriet?
And Mr Knightley thinks that Emma should have taken up Jane.
Yeah.
But in fact, Emma was put off by the way Jane speaks, whereas we hear her speaking in probably exactly the same way to Mrs Elton. And Mrs Elton doesn't care, and she teases her and speaks to her as her little pet and so on. And Jane puts up with it.
Yeah.
She would also like to patronise Jane, but she tries to be open to Jane. Jane pulls the shutter down.
Yeah.
And so she can't take her on in the way Mrs Elton does.
Yeah. I think it would have been a slightly different relationship, though, because Mrs Elton wants to patronise Jane. With Emma, it would have been less patronage and more just welcoming her into a friendship circle.
Well, the other problem for Emma is always that she doesn't feel she can patronise Jane from superiority.
Yeah.
And yet Jane is refusing to go into a girls together thing.
Yeah, whereas Mrs Elton can patronise not from a superiority of any actual merit, but because she is a married woman.
One point that came up to me with the things Mrs Elton says is that practically all of them are things that Emma believes, like, I don't want finery, or I always staying at home. But one of the problems is Mrs Elton makes these generalisations and they always apply to herself.
Yes, this is the good thing and this is me.
But the point is, most of the good things she says are not things that Emma would really disagree with. She thinks you should have your resources. You should move in society. You have an obligation. But she doesn't believe Mrs Elton is living according to that code.
And then in the conversation with Mrs Weston and Mr Knightley about Mrs Elton and Jane, it's another one of these scenes where Mr Knightley says something. In this case, maybe she's accepting Mrs. Elton's attentions because no one else gives them to her. And Emma, at the time, argues back, says, I prefer Mrs. Weston's interpretation that she wants just to get some time away from Miss Bates.
Yeah.
But then afterwards, she reflects on it, which she's done before with stuff from Mr. Knight.
Oh, it's part of their relationship. He says something, she disagrees, they have a lovely little fight, and then she accepts.
But never to his face. She goes away and she thinks about it. You know, deep down underneath, where she's not going to let it show to anyone, she kind of accepts some of what he says. I think they're all wrong about why Jane accepts Mrs. Elton, because I think it's just the amount of energy and emotion she'd have to put in to
really cut her off.
Yeah, is just probably not worth it. We'll see in the next chapters where she draws her lines.
And we have to remember that Jane has, after all, spent all her life being, in effect, the poor relation.
Yeah.
The Campbells have been lovely to her, but she's had this sort of feeling, I have to sort of earn my bread.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, is there's a power imbalance in that if Jane is rude to Mrs. Elton and you're really rude and rejects her and cuts her off and everything, how might the Eltons take that out on her aunt and her grandmother? She is not in Highbury for the rest of her life, but her aunt and her grandmother are. And I just think Jane has to be aware of this, and this has to be having some impact on her dealings with Mrs. Elton. It has to.
Well, again, it's back to this, maintain the equilibrium, keep the surface.
Yeah.
Fine. She's thinking to herself, I can put up with this for my aunt and my grandmother.
Yeah.
I think you're probably right, probably more that than wanting to get away from Miss Bates.
Yeah, I don't agree with Mrs. Weston on that, and
I think that's almost a mean thing to think about,
yeah.
Jane.
I would have expected better from Mrs. Weston.
Yes, than to say anyone would want to get away from Miss Bates.
I think it is quite possible that Jane welcomes some space from Miss Bates. I think the way she would welcome that is to be going for a walk on her own. To the post office, in the fields.
In the rain, yes.
I really don't think that she would find spending time with Mrs. Elton preferable to spending time with her aunt.
No, she couldn't.
It would be worse.
One of the things that is sort of fascinating about this all-male company of Highbury was Mr. Cole making that hint to Mr. Knightley about Jane. It just, again, enriches this picture of this strong male community that exists.
Yeah, presumably he said this, maybe not at the whist club with everyone there, but it's just part of that conversation that they have.
Having a sort of a bit of a joke or something like that. Well, we don't know how he said it.
So the last 3 chapters that we're talking about all deal with the dinner that Emma is giving for Mrs. Elton. Chapter 34 starts with Emma planning to give a dinner, and the rest of chapter 34, all of chapter 35 and all of chapter 36 are all about the dinner.
And these are fascinating chapters. This whole piece is just lovely, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things with the planning is, again, some more about Mr. Woodhouse. First of all, that he agrees that it must be done, but 8 is the maximum he can have. So he gets very stressed when he thinks Mr. John Knightley is going to make 9. Then when Mr. Weston drops out, he's happy again.
Yes.
And then when it comes to the dinner party itself in the next chapter, we see that one of the things he does is that he circulates and he talks to everybody and he gives compliments to all the ladies. And then when he's done that, he's done his duty so he can go and sit down again.
But I suppose, in my view of Mr. Woodhouse, there are certain things he's learnt and he's very keen on them. He knows how you should behave to young ladies. He knows what his duties as a host are.
Yeah.
He's learned off a lot of the etiquette rules.
I think he does like having people around, so long as they're people that don't push his boundaries. He likes having people there that he can talk to. It's not like he has these rules to get him through a difficult social situation.
No.
And I think he particularly feels safer with women.
Yes.
But the one who doesn't like social situations, of course, is John Knightley.
Yes.
So he makes note of Mrs. Elton so he can pass it back to Isabella. But then he wants to go and talk to Jane because she's an old acquaintance and a quiet girl and he can talk to her.
Yes.
And they have this lovely conversation about the post office.
Yes.
him saying, when you have lived to my age, you will begin to think letters are never worth going through the rain for. And Jane does actually come out of her shell a bit and shows some emotion when she says, you have everybody dearest to you always at hand. I probably never shall again, and therefore till I have outlived all my affections, a post office I think must always have the power to draw me out. And then when he sort of hints that in 10 years' time she will probably be married herself, and she sort of smiles quietly at it, which again is just one of those hints that we can pick up the second time through but might miss the first time through.
Yes. This is really the only picture in the book where we really know what Jane Fairfax is like. That she's got sort of good social conversation.
Yeah.
What spoils her for Emma is she won't then move to intimacy.
But as I said, I think in this there is a little bit of actual genuine emotion. It's not just surface chit-chat.
She does hold sensible conversations that talk about a little bit of feeling and a little bit of the social world. I mean, she has intelligent conversation.
Yeah. But then when we compare her post office conversation with John Knightley to Mrs Elton on the post office, Mrs Elton saying, you will do this, and Jane saying, no, thank you. And Mrs Elton saying, I insist, and Jane saying, no, thank you. She is not being impolite, but this is something she's not budging on. So I think that's where she draws her line. She will accept Mrs Elton's patronage to a certain point for whatever reason. We've talked about what I think the reasons are. But when it comes to certain things, that's it.
And she can handle it in the way, say, Elizabeth Bennet would handle it,
Yes.
or Eleanor Dashwood.
And then after dinner, when Mrs Elton is pushing her into finding a situation, I just think, poor Jane, she's just being battered and battered and battered, and all she can do is say, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you. That's all she can do.
There's one thing that I found fascinating about that dinner party. Nothing about Mr. Elton. Mr. Elton does not figure at all.
Well, he's there.
He's there, but he does nothing, just sits there and lets Mrs. Elton tell all about him. Mr. Elton is not mentioned throughout those three chapters. Well, he's mentioned by Mrs. Elton, but a lovely little piece there with John Knightley, the little picture about the boys having counted enough raindrops.
Yes.
There he was out with his sons having nice sort of things you do with young children.
Again, we've seen at times he can be grumpy. But at the same time, we do get this sense that he loves his sons. He has a really happy family life, and that's all he wants. He wants to go home to his family and be with his family.
And when he comes, if he's got to spend his evening with anyone, he'd like to spend it alone with his brother.
Of course, following off the bit you said earlier, when Mr. Weston turns up, John Knightley only was in mute astonishment that a man who could have spent his evening quietly at home after a day of business in London should set off again and walk half a mile to another man's house for the sake of being in mixed company till bedtime, of finishing his day in the efforts of civility and the noise of numbers, was a circumstance to strike him deeply. And of course, one of the reasons Mr. Weston wanted to come is because the news about Frank, and he has to share it with everyone, and he's sure that everyone will find it fascinating.
And he wants to tell them one by one.
Yeah. But then the last chapter that we're talking about, most of that chapter, it's so funny. This competition between Mr. Weston, who wants to talk about Frank and about the Churchills, and Mrs. Elton, who wants to talk about herself and the Sucklings and Maple Grove. At one point, Mrs. Elton coughs.
And he leaps in, yes.
I just find it one of the funniest exchanges.
Yes.
And then the chapter finishes with this lovely conversation where John Knightley is saying, you've got all these engagements. And then Emma, and I think quite rightly, defends herself by saying, I don't have all these engagements. In any case, even if I do have all these engagements, how would it solve things to send the boys to Mr. Knightley's place? Because anywhere I am, he is.
Yes, the whole lot has been absolutely lovely.
And of course, this is actually the end, not just of the chapter, but of volume the second, where after Emma has said all of that, it says, Mr. Knightley seemed to be trying not to smile. So he appreciates everything she's saying and is enjoying it. And succeeded without difficulty upon Mrs. Elton's beginning to talk to him.
Yes.
It's just so funny.
Yes.
So, favourite sentence. There were so many funny lines and funny scenes. I pulled out a whole lot I could have for my favourite sentence. But then when I was putting my notes together, a not funny sentence actually really struck me. And I'd like to use that instead, because I've read out some of the funny ones anyway. It's when they're talking to Jane about going to the post office. And Jane very patiently assured her that she had not caught any cold. And that's not funny, but I think just that very patiently assured her really just gives such a sense of poor Jane just being hit. I won't say attacked, because she's not being attacked, but just hit on all sides by these. They're all well-meaning. Even Mrs Elton, while there's self-aggrandizement in it, she's still basically well-meaning. All these well-meaning people, and really all Jane wants to do is be left alone. So she just very patiently assured her that she had not caught any cold.
Yes. Well, the one I chose was a funny one. I'll read out the bit I have chosen for a sentence and then explain a bit more why. Mr. Weston is talking to Mrs. Elton, and he says, "Depend upon it, Mrs. Churchill does everything that any other fine lady ever did. Mrs. Churchill will not be second to any lady in the land." And for me, that is the absolute peak of all the funny stuff that turns up in those, particularly, of course, because it puts Mrs. Elton in such a terrible spot.
It suddenly puts her on the back foot, and she starts to think maybe she's been positioning her sister Selina wrong.
Well, she says, Mrs. Elton eagerly interposed with, "Oh, Mr. Weston, do not mistake me. Selina is no fine lady, I assure you. Do not run away with such an idea. Is not she? Then she is no rule for Mrs. Churchill, who is as thorough a fine lady as anybody ever beheld." I mean, it's the whole piece. It's not a sentence, but it's just, that one has stayed with me for so long. It's one of the things I've always remembered from Emma.
The character we're talking about today is Mrs. Elton. And I would actually rate her as one of my favourite comic characters in Jane Austen. And I've said before, up until this read-through, I've never particularly liked Emma. It's not been one of my favourite Jane Austens. But even then, I always loved Mrs. Elton. I thought she was the best part of the book.
Right, yes.
And I have always sort of just followed on with Emma's view that she is funny because of her vulgarity and her lack of self-awareness and her self-aggrandizement. But I just wanted to read a little bit from the introduction to Diana Burchell's book In Defence of Mrs. Elton, where she retells the story with Mrs. Elton as a more sympathetic character. She says, "Perhaps it's partly because I grew up in New York City that the first time I read Emma, I didn't recognise what was so awful about Mrs. Elton. Her behaviour seemed quite natural and understandable to me. I've always felt that there was something almost American, if not New Yorkerish, about Mrs. Elton. She's so brassy, aggressive, larger than life. But those are traits we're taught to admire in New York, in order not to get trampled. And I saw that Mrs. Elton was a newcomer, a bride, in a small town, unsure of her social position. She wanted to be friendly and to be accepted, and so she did things like propose to Emma that they unite to form a musical society. Yet whatever she did or said, it was always wrong, and the other characters, the discerning ones, reacted as though she were the crassest creature ever. However, instead of shuddering at her atrocious manners, as we are meant to do, I felt rather sorry for her. Obviously, the poor woman simply didn't know how to behave. Yes, she was officious and inappropriate, but so were half the people I knew. So just why did everybody loathe her so?" I don't entirely agree with what she's saying, but I do think it's a legitimate point of view. And in her Defence of Mrs. Elton story, she does show Mrs. Elton as actually being somewhat underconfident.
And look, I have to say that this time reading through, I started to feel that, what is she coming from? When I was preparing for this, I put down 3 possible motivations. Was Mrs. Elton somebody just behaving in character like Lady Catherine de Bourgh? On the other hand, was she determined to establish her credentials to be a leader with confidence? She came in, she knew who she was, she'd come out the leader? Or was she determined to establish her credentials to be a leader, assuming it was going to be a real battle?
I don't think it's Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
No.
I do think it was a case of coming in and basically thinking, I have a position and I'm going to make absolutely sure everybody recognises my position.
I got fairly fascinated with the social background. And we have that piece at the beginning where it says, what she was must be uncertain, but who she was might be found out. And setting aside the £10,000, it did not appear that she was at all Harriet's superior. She brought no name, no blood, no alliance. Miss Hawkins was the youngest of 2 daughters of a Bristol, then it says a dash, merchant, of course, he must be called. But as the whole of the profits of his mercantile life appeared so very moderate, it was not unfair to guess the dignity of his line of trade had been very moderate also. And I'm wanting to think about what is Jane Austen saying and all that.
Can I just read the footnote that is in the Oxford Classics edition edited by John Mullen? He's referring here specifically to the bit where it says Bristol dash merchant, of course he must be called. He says, there have been some differences of opinion about the reason for Emma's scorn, signalled by the punctuation. Some have thought that because of Bristol's prominence as the main port for trade with the West Indies, America and Africa, she might be supposing that Miss Hawkins' father was involved in the slave trade, abolished in 1807. On the evidence of the rest of the sentence, it is more likely that Emma is snobbishly inferring that he was not a merchant, but some more lowly tradesman or retailer. There are lots of articles on the internet on both sides of that argument, and rather than go through all the details, I will put some links on there, for example, to a Jasna one that says she must have been connected with the slave trade, some articles by Lona Manning saying, no, I think it was all about the vulgarity, not about the slavery connections. But I know you also wanted to talk a bit more about your point of view.
Well, there's one thing that I suppose comes to me, and that is what was so special about being called merchant. We know that in Bristol, because it had the Atlantic trade, there were people who made enormous amounts of money out of importing very suspect commodities like tobacco, like sugar, like coffee. And they made huge amounts of money, and they would have been known as West Indian merchants.
And just to make it absolutely clear, when you say very suspect, what you mean is they were produced by the labour of enslaved people.
Yes. But on the other hand, there is this question of where did people rank? A bit later in the Victorian period, I know for sure that someone who called himself a merchant saw themselves as very much above somebody who ran a shop, say.
Yep.
And so I did a little bit of a run through the use of the word trade. Mr. Weston is not a merchant.
Yeah.
Mr. Weston is in trade. I had a little look at Pride and Prejudice, and Sir William Lucas was in trade, and Mrs. Bennet's brother in London was in trade. And so merchant seems to be a term related to these big importing towns. That's what I'm thinking merchant means here. He was in some sort of trade, but he obviously wasn't one of the major merchants. He was quite minor.
You're making that interpretation because of the fact that there's this dash and then merchant, of course, he must be called.
If you come from Bristol, you call yourself a merchant. I think it's just a reference to the purse-proudness of Bristol, which was terribly well known, and they were calling themselves merchants rather than being in trade.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but what really comes through more in terms of Mrs. Elton's claims are her claims to her sister, who lives in Maple Grove. And Maple Grove comes up and up and up.
yes.
And the barouche landau. She has to keep saying the name and saying the name and saying the name. But Mrs. Elton claims her relationship entirely with the man who's bought property rather than with her father and whatever
Yeah.
he was a merchant in.
Yeah. Possibly the reason she is so out there and pushy is that she's afraid people will try to undercut her if she doesn't stake out her claim.
Which again may be that she comes from a society and perhaps that's what it was like in Bristol, or if they were one of the families that had just moved up to the beautiful new terrace houses up in Clifton and everybody there was elbowing everyone else. In a sense, one can almost say Jane Austen sees this as a Bristol characteristic, that nearly everybody is new money and they're all elbowing one another.
Something I wanted to talk about, when Emma is going on about Mrs Elton and she says that she is a little upstart vulgar being with her Mr E and her cara sposo and her resources. And I just wanted to look at the use of the word resources and cara sposo. First of all, I found it interesting that Mrs Elton always talks about her resources, and I didn't think I'd come across this word much before in Jane Austen. So I did a word search on the complete works that I have, and the term resources appears 15 times across all the major works.
Right.
10 of those 15 times are in Emma,
Yeah.
and 9 of those 10 times are either spoken by or about Mrs Elton.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the first time it's used in the book is when Emma talks about having her own resources so she doesn't need to get married. And she's not talking about money, she's talking about activity. And I guess I'm just fascinated by the fact that Mrs Elton, she says, "Blessed with so many resources within myself, the world was not necessary to me. I could do very well without it. To those who had no resources, it was a different thing. But my resources made me quite independent." She's just using and using this word. And I'm trying to work out, is there some nuance that I'm missing about that overuse of the word resources is a bit vulgar?
I think the vulgarity is her claiming it and claiming it. The thing I was saying, that a lot of what she's claiming is what Emma
Yeah.
believes. She uses it in the wrong context.
Yes. And she uses it too much.
It's something that she's cottoned onto. This is something that shows you're a refined and elegant woman, is you have resources.
Yes. So, yeah, that was what I wanted to say about resources, just as it noting that Mrs Elton uses this word far more than anybody else in all of Jane Austen.
Yes.
So the other thing I wanted to talk about from Emma's rant is cara sposo, which I think we can all agree is Mrs Elton trying to sound clever and with it when talking about her husband. But
Yes.
the interesting thing about that is the spelling. So John Sutherland in Can Jane Eyre Be Happy has a chapter on how vulgar is Mrs Elton and particularly focuses on this use of the Italian term. One thing he points out is in the original text, the first time she uses the term, she doesn't say caro sposo, which is the correct Italian term. She says cara sposo, which is ungrammatical.
Yes.
And then later on, she actually says cara sposa, which is even more ungrammatical. Now, Chapman, who, as we all know, did the definitive edition in the early 20th century,
Yes.
he gave it the correct spelling each time. And I'm reading from John Sutherland here. His editorial judgment was evidently that these linguistic lapses were printer's errors which might be cleaned up without distracting comment. But since then, some people have said Mrs Elton mispronouncing it is intentional by Jane Austen and meant to show just how vulgar and uneducated she is, that she tries to use this snappy term and she gets it wrong. Now, John Sutherland, in the end, comes down to thinking, yes, it was a printer's error, because he thinks Mrs Elton would not be so uneducated to get that phrase wrong. But he also thinks it is still meant to be a signifier because the term cara sposo had in fact become unfashionable by the time Mrs Elton is using it.
Well, the thing I want to add to that is, after all, Jane Austen had Mrs Elton misquoting from Gray's Elegy, probably, the best-known non-Shakespeare poem of the time, and saying Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its fragrance on the desert air, when she should have said waste its sweetness on the desert air.
Where Fanny Price quotes from Cooper, you feel that that's legitimate.
Well, she's read a lot of Cooper.
She's read a lot of Cooper, and her mind just naturally comes up with an idea, and she relates it to Cooper, whereas with Mrs Elton it feels much more studied. I guess coming back to it in the end, all the talking about the Sucklings and Maple Grove and the Baruch Landau, all of that is probably coming from a level of insecurity about her background.
I think I do on occasion feel sorry for her that she is there, trying to sort of fight for this position she thinks she's entitled to.
But I don't think Jane Austen means us to feel sorry for her. And
I
do think, like I said, for me, she is one of the funniest characters in Jane Austen.
Yes. For my historical piece in this session, I've decided to talk about governesses, which links up with the conversation between Jane Fairfax and Mrs Elton. In April 1811, Jane Austen wrote to Cassandra about the governess who had just been employed by her landowning brother, Edward Knight. And she said, "I like your opinion of Miss Allen much better than I expected, and have now hopes of her staying a whole 12-month. By this time, I suppose, she is hard at it, governing away. Poor creature, I pity her, though they are my nieces." This pity turns up quite a lot in the literature of the 18th and 19th centuries. The governess was very much shown as finding herself in an anomalous and lonely position. In 1848, the art critic Elizabeth Eastlake wrote, "The real definition of a governess in the English sense is a being who is our equal in birth, manners and education, but our inferior in worldly wealth. Take a lady in every meaning of the word, born and bred, and let her father pass through the Gazette, that meant become bankrupt. And she wants nothing more to suit our highest beau ideal of a guide and instructress to our children. There is no other class which so cruelly requires the members to be in birth, mind and manners above their station in order to fit them for that station."
Okay, yeah.
In Emma, Jane Austen leaves the reader in no doubt that this, in effect, expulsion from the class of her birth was what Jane Fairfax looked forward to. This is what she says. With the fortitude of a devoted novitiate, she had resolved at 21 to complete the sacrifice and retire from all the pleasures of life, of rational intercourse, equal society, peace and hope, to penance and mortification forever. The usual explanation of why a governess suffered penance and mortification forever was the governess's position in the household. She was treated as and expected to mix with the servants, though as a lady born and bred, the servants' language, manners and habits grated on her, and she found no one among them who shared her intellectual and artistic interests. On the other hand, the adult members of the family who could have shared these interests rarely sought her company. She was expected to spend her waking time not just teaching the children, but supervising their games and their hobbies. And something that's interesting to note is that when Mrs Elton describes the enticements that a nouveau riche family like the Sucklings might use to get a status symbol governess, she focuses on the living conditions that was to distinguish her from the servants. With your superior talents, you have a right to move in the first circle. Your musical knowledge alone would entitle you to name your own terms, have as many rooms as you like, I presume that means that she wouldn't have to sleep up in a servant's bedroom and might have 2 or 3 schoolrooms. And mix in the family as much as you chose. I found that fascinating, that what she's stipulating fits so completely with that being cut off from her class.
Yeah.
This passage, however, is doing a lot more than just giving us the information about a governess's conditions. Jane Austen seems to be implying here that a family trying to establish itself among the local gentry would have to offer such luxuries to hire a top-quality governess into their households. One wonders, though, if they were offered to Miss Lee at Mansfield Park, or to Miss Allen and to Jane Austen's friend Anne Sharp at Godmersham. Later in the Victorian period, when attention was being focused on the plight of the governess, many writers tended to imply, as Mrs Eastlake did in that passage I read earlier, that the typical governess was a lady born and bred whom tragic financial circumstances had forced to earn her own living, and whose only resource was to pass on the education, and more especially the accomplishments, that she had received from her own education. But this is not quite what the situation is with Jane Fairfax. She's known from a tiny girl that she will have to earn her own living, and indeed many future governesses acquired the accomplishments they needed by becoming apprentices in a ladies' academy, where they learnt languages and accomplishments from the visiting masters in return for teaching and supervising the younger girls. The future art critic Anna Jameson, the daughter of an Irish artist who later wrote an account of her trials as a governess, gained her education this way, and Thackeray gave a similar background to Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair. So what actually happened in a Regency schoolroom? As Maria Edgeworth makes clear in her tale The Good French Governess, published in 1801, it was accepted that each child had its own individual curriculum and would learn at its own pace. So in a schoolroom like the one at Godmersham, the governess could have half a dozen pupils, each engaged in a separate activity to organise throughout the teaching part of the day. This must have required considerable planning, and the governess in such a family probably had to cope with tricks and tantrums and many other sorts of bad behaviour, quite beyond organising all these daily programs. In some families, at least, however, she could expect little sympathy. Witness Mrs Norris's comment when Fanny was introduced into the schoolroom. It will be just the same to Miss Lee whether she has 3 girls to teach or only 2. There can be no difference. Of course, things were easier for some governesses. Mrs Weston, Miss Taylor that was, has spent more than 16 years acting as pseudo-mother to 2 biddable girls.
I'd question just how biddable Emma is. There would have been things that she just wouldn't have done and Miss Taylor would have just had to give up.
But at least she was deeply fond of them.
Oh, yeah.
And the whole family was appreciative of her. And she stayed on in the household, rather like, if one remembers, the old nursery maid in Persuasion, who, having brought up all the children and seen the very last the lingering and long-petted Master Harry sent to school after his brothers, she stayed on, and Miss Taylor did, but it wasn't necessarily the case.
Yeah.
Lady Bertram, for example, felt no obligation to reward a governess for long service. She says to Mrs Norris, "I think, sister, we need not keep Miss Lee any longer when Fanny goes to live with you." They're going to say, right, here's your notice, find a new place for yourself.
She doesn't even say we shall have to help Miss Lee find a new place. She just says we won't need her anymore.
Yes, well,
It's very casual.
In consequence to this sort of disregard, a number of governesses ended their lives in poverty. In the 1840s, when Jane Fairfax's contemporaries were entering their 50s, a society formed to help governesses in distress was reporting cases like this. They're really very sad. Miss S.M.A., aged 59, father a colonel in the active service until Waterloo, governess upon his death and that of an only brother, assisted relations to the utmost of her power. Frequent illnesses have consumed her savings, is now in very delicate health, earned only £10 in the past year. Miss S.A., aged 68, father a large calico printer, her mother having impoverished herself to assist her son's speculations. She gave up the whole of her property to her and became a governess, and to the same purpose devoted all her earnings. Is now entirely dependent upon the kindness of friends. Miss O.S.G.B., aged 57, father a captain in the army. Her husband, a surgeon, died suddenly, having made no provision for her and 2 children. Assisted her mother for some years. She is suffering from chronic bronchitis and sciatica, and a daughter also in very ill health, without certain income, being dependent on the letting of her apartments. On the other hand, it is likely that most of these pitied young women did not remain governesses for very long. In the 1990s, when I was spending a lot of time working on the 1851 UK census, which is the earliest source of reliable figures on women in particular occupations, I constructed a graph comparing the numbers in various age groups of governesses, dressmakers, and domestic servants.
And I'll put a copy of that graph in the show notes.
Right. This showed that all 3 were primarily occupations for young unmarried women. 80% of dressmakers and 70% of governesses were under 35 years of age, and it looked as if most governesses had left the profession by the time they were 40. Some of them may, like Mrs Goddard and Jane Austen's friend Anne Sharp, have opened their own schools, but it seems likely that in spite of their loss of status, that most of them would have managed to do what Mrs Bennet would have called find husbands while still relatively young. Or even much later, as Miss Taylor did.
Yes.
Of course, not all the governesses recorded in the census were ladies born and bred and so cut off from marriage with men of their own class. Probably many of them did not come from gentry families and were not working in gentry households, but looking after the children of prosperous farmers and men in trade. Nevertheless, it looks as if Jane Fairfax's picture of lifelong servitude was somewhat exaggerated, even for the gentry class.
This week, for the pop culture version, I am going to be talking about Emma Approved, which was a web series from 2013. Emma Approved was done by Pemberley Digital, who are the same people who did the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. Emma Approved has 72 episodes, running sort of between 2 minutes and I think the longest might be 7 or 8 minutes long. So quite a long time it runs for if you watch them all back to back.
Yes.
Which means, unlike movie versions or even like miniseries, it has a lot more capacity to fully cover all the plot points. So this is a modernised version of Emma. The setup is that Emma Woodhouse and Alex Knightley are business partners in a company that is part of the Highbury and Partners Lifestyle Group, which is owned by Emma's father.
Yeah.
But the sub-company they run is called Emma Approved, and it is a matchmaking and lifestyle company. Emma is kind of the public face and the driving force and the inspiration and the ideas. Alex is the partner of business development and bookkeeping. So basically he's the back end, the numbers. He keeps it all working behind the scenes.
Yes.
With Lizzie Bennet Diaries, the concept was this is a video blog that Lizzie Bennet is keeping as part of her studies. This one is footage Emma is filming to document her greatness.
Oh,
So
right.
that they can turn it into a documentary about what a wonderfully successful young female entrepreneur she is. There doesn't seem to be a really significant age difference between Emma and, I'm going to just call him Alex in this because
Yes.
that's what he's generally referred to. But what you get in terms of the older, stuffier Knightley is the fact that Alex he does what Emma calls the boring stuff.
Yes.
To be honest, it got me a bit offside right from the start because it starts with the Weston's wedding that Emma has been organising. And you have a situation where Annie Weston wants to pull out of the wedding and wants Emma to cancel everything. Emma doesn't want to do this. And what really got to me, and what I did feel was not Emma of the book, is that in order to convince Annie not to cancel the wedding, Emma basically lies and deceives her and says she's done stuff that she doesn't. I just really didn't like that because I did feel that Emma in the book, while she feels she knows better than anyone else, and while she is prepared to tell a few lies, like pretending she's broken her bootlace and pretending she doesn't have any court plaster to hand, so Harriet
Yes.
will give hers to Mr. Elton, she doesn't do this level of deception, and that really bothered me. But this is actually redeemed by something that happens not too much later that is quite different from the book. Isabella, who's called Izzy in this, turns up. You never see her husband, you never see her kids, they're talked about. But Emma can tell that something is not right in their marriage. And Izzy is unhappy. And so Emma basically makes this big plan, and Izzy and John have a fight about it. But as a result of that, they start talking to each other and resolve their problems that he didn't even know were problems. And Alex, his brother, didn't even know there were problems. And what you get there, and Alex actually says this to Emma, that she was the only one who could see that Izzy was unhappy. And she did this because she cared about Izzy. It doesn't redeem what she did in the first section, but it kind of makes you more sympathetic towards her. And it also, I think, makes you see what Alex sees in her. Because that's one of the things I really, really liked in this production was the relationship between Alex and Emma.
Right.
They had lots of banter between them. They had lots of laughter. You got that thing that you talked about in the book of Emma kind of mentally keeping score with Alex. You know, well, he was right about this, but I was right about that, and I was right about that.
Yes.
You just get this picture that Alex finds Emma totally infuriating at times, but at the same time, he's absolutely fascinated by her, and he doesn't always agree with her methods, but he says she is good at what she does. She is good at reading people. And you do get, at least in this first part, this sense that she does actually want to help people, which of course is what Emma in the book does.
Yes.
I've said that a lot of the other adaptations tended to sacrifice mostly the Jane plot, but sometimes the Harriet plot.
Yes.
This production does manage, I think, to give enough weight to both plots. So Harriet is employed as Emma's assistant.
Yes.
And Emma sort of sees her a bit like in Clueless, where Cher sees Ty as an opportunity for a makeover. Emma does the same. She's convincing Harriet to believe in herself and to, wear high heels and be confident. And then Martin is the IT guy.
Yes.
And Emma basically decides Harriet is going places and she could do so much better than Martin.
Emma thinks that Martin has got a skill, but he's stuck with that. He's not trying to rise.
Yeah,
yes.
his horizons are low, whereas she sees Harriet as being able to go further.
Yes.
Rightly or wrongly. What they have done with Mrs. Elton is the woman Senator Elton marries, they have brought back Carolyn Lee from Lizzie Bennet Diaries.
Carolyn Lee is the same as Miss Bingley.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. My first thought was that is so completely wrong because in terms of where she sits socially, she is not the same kind of social climbing upstart that Mrs. Elton is.
Yeah.
But having said that, it did actually work really well because the actress who played Carolyn Lee was actually really good. She's got this sweet voice and everything she says is just dripping with totally insincere niceness.
Yeah.
And so underneath she's basically a complete bitch. So it worked really well. Now, another thing that I think differs from the book and that I quite liked is that Harriet does grow in the course of this. She does become more confident, but whereas in the book and in some of the adaptations, she becomes overconfident for her place in society. In this one, she has become what Emma wanted her to be, confident and sure of herself. So what you get is, after the Box Hill scene, which in this is the launch of a new celebrity restaurant called Box, Boxx, which is in the hills.
Yes.
But after that, when Emma is absolutely distraught, Harriet is the one who comes to her and says, you need to pull yourself together. We're going to work. We're going to solve this. And I thought that was really nice.
Yes.
It showed that Emma had actually...
She's done some good for Harriet.
She's done some good for Harriet. She has made Harriet into a confident person, and when it's necessary, Harriet can tell Emma what to do. And I thought that was really nice.
Yes.
So then there's the Jane plot. It's probably still a little bit lower than the Harriet plot in importance, but they give it a lot more weight than some of the other adaptations do. In this one, Maddie Bates is an old family friend, and she runs a financial services business that is not doing very well. Jane grew up and went to school with Emma, but then went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and since then she's been working in the non-profit sector and has quite a high profile. But she comes back for reasons not explained, and Alex says they should bring Jane on to help them, particularly because they're moving even more into event organising and benefits, and they need some high-profile causes and contacts. You do see Emma doesn't like Jane, but is trying really, really, really hard to be positive about her, which again I liked. There is a great scene of Emma trying to get Jane to talk about herself and Jane focusing entirely on business, which again is very fitting with the book. Frank is very high-powered businessman. Now, it's obviously always a little bit of a stretch to adapt some things to the modern setting, and in this case, the reason the relationship was secret was mainly because Jane didn't want to just be seen as an appendage to Frank because he was so well-known and high-profile. And she breaks it off with him because one of the companies he has a partnership with is actually opposed to some of the good work she is trying to do for the world. One thing they did was, after the relationship was revealed, between that episode and the next episode of the main Emma Approved, they released a series of very short videos just of Jane and Frank, and it was kind of like flashback videos. So moments when Frank had walked out of Emma's office and walked down to Jane's office, you then got to see what had happened in Jane's office.
Yes.
And the first time he walked in, he was about to talk to her, and then she pointed to the camera and he realised, okay, we're being filmed.
Yeah.
But you got these touch points in their relationship, moments you don't get in the book, which I thought was nice.
Yes.
So that was Emma Approved. When I first watched it, I did not like it anywhere near as much as I liked Lizzie Bennet Diaries. And I think that was partly because those opening scenes really highlighted and made even worse the aspects of Emma, Jane Austen's character, that I don't like. Rewatching it this time, I'm still not really comfortable with the amount of lying and deception Emma does, particularly in the first half.
Yes.
But overall, I thought they did a pretty good job of turning it into an engaging series that mapped very much point for point with the book. I loved the relationship between Alex and Emma. I thought they worked really well. And I liked that they did actually make Harriet a character who grew in a positive way throughout the series.
No, the thing I was just wondering then is they did not manage to get the mystery into it.
They did. As with the book and all productions, the reader is left to feel clever because they picked it that Mr. Elton was after Emma, not Harriet. You get that. I think you do feel there is a bit of a mystery with Jane that you don't really know what it is.
Yes.
Right. So that was Emma Approved. Next time, I'm going to be talking about the 2017 web series, The Emma Agenda. You've been listening to the Reading Jane Austen podcast with me, Harriet.
And me, Ellen. In our next episode, we'll be looking at chapters 37 to 41 of Emma.
The structure of this podcast was inspired by Harry Potter and the Sacred Text. Our music is Creative Commons performances of pieces Jane Austen might have listened to.
You can find us on our website, readingjaneausten.com.
Our Facebook is Reading Jane Austen, and our Instagram is reading_Jane_Austen. You can email us at readingjaneausten.com or rate and review us in your podcast app. We hope you'll join us next time.